Hi there, Alison here with another Cab Franc du jour. Today we are in the Niagara Peninsula of Ontario, Canada, and we're looking at the Inniskillin 2019 Cabernet Franc Icewine. Inniskillin was founded by Donald Zeraldo and Carl Kaiser in 1975, making it the first winery in Ontario to be granted a license since Prohibition. The late Carl Kaiser was born in Austria, and his first successful attempt at making Icewine in Ontario was in 1984. But it was his 1989 Vidal Icewine that took top honors at the Vinexpo wine competition in Bordeaux that helped to put Canada on the global wine map. Icewine production in Canada is regulated by the VQA, this is the Vintners Quality Alliance, and this is essentially our appellation of origin system here. There's a chapter in Ontario as well as a chapter in British Columbia. But Ontario actually represents 90% of Canada's ice wine production. So when I'm throwing out stats today, it all has to do with Ontario. So ice wine in Canada is made to the exacting standards as it is in Germany and Austria, and only these three countries have an agreement within the framework of the World Trade Organization that regulates the production of ice wine. So if you come across an ice wine from another part of the world that isn't these three countries, you actually cannot be guaranteed how that wine was produced. So by law, the grapes must be left to freeze naturally on the vine, and a sustained temperature of at least -8 degrees Celsius or colder, that's around 17 Fahrenheit or colder, is required by law for harvest. Now, this temperature can happen in December, it can happen in February. Mother Nature decides that. So it's not the calendar day that is specific here for harvest. It is this -8 degrees temperature that we require by law. Now, during this time period leading up to harvest, the grapes can experience several freeze and thaw periods. This is very critical for increasing the complexity in the finished wine. Typically in Ontario, ice wine harvest happens between -10 and -12 degrees Celsius. This is 14 to 10 Fahrenheit, and this happens at nighttime because this is when we can be guaranteed a consistent temperature for harvest time, and there's no fluctuations during that time period. Now, of course, when we are pressing the grapes, we are pressing them frozen as well. And this is important because it helps to ensure that the water content in each and every berry is frozen solid. So when we press, we get this very tiny drop of extremely concentrated sweet juice out of each and every berry. And this is what we ferment into wine. Now, there is a direct correlation between the temperature at harvest and the Brix level at harvest. And the Brix is essentially the starting sugar in the juice before fermentation. And by law, the minimum Brix at harvest for ice wine is 35 degrees Brix, which equates to around 350 grams per liter starting sugar. Now, of course, when the temperature drops, the Brix levels go up. So as we get lower in temperature, we get more Brix. So we're getting more and more concentrated sugars, but we're also getting more concentrated acidity as well, which is, of course, important for achieving that all-important balance that we are seeking from our naturally sweet wine. Now, when the fermentation is complete, the minimum residual sugar content required by law in ice wine is 170 grams per liter residual sugar, and the alcohol will typically fall around 9.5 to 12%. Now, in Ontario, the number one grape for ice wine production is Vidal. It's a hybrid grape. It's the only hybrid that is allowed for ice wine production. But Cabernet Franc has emerged in a very short period of time to be a very important grape. Actually, it's number 2 behind Vidal in terms of ice wine, at least in most vintages. So Vidal represents around 73% of ice wine production. Cabernet Franc typically comes in at around 15% of ice wine production, making Cabernet Franc the number 1 vinifera grape for ice wine in Ontario. Riesling is a close third, usually is around 9 to 10%, but Cab Franc has really emerged as an important grape, primarily because it has a little bit thicker skinned, it's a bit more resilient on the vine, it doesn't break down quite as quickly, it's not as sensitive to rot as what Riesling is. Now, getting back to this freeze and thaw process that I mentioned earlier, this is super important, particularly for Cabernet Franc ice wine, because this is how we achieve the color in the finished wine. So these freeze and thaw periods, they help to break down the skins of the Cabernet Franc grapes, and then this releases pigment, it releases tannin into the pulp of the berry. So when we press the grapes, what is essentially happening here is the grape is self-macerating on the vine. So when we press the grapes, we actually are extracting red juice from the Cabernet Franc berries. So the color of your Cabernet Franc ice wine will vary depending on the vintage conditions, depending on this freeze and thaw effect, and it also depends on the patience of the grape grower and when they choose to harvest. If they choose to harvest their grapes right at the first crack, the first time they get -8 degrees Celsius, they may not achieve the same complexity and color in the finished wine. But of course, if they wait, then they're at the hands of Mother Nature, and they got to make sure that, well, they have to wait to see whether or not they will get another window of those perfect ice wine harvest conditions. Now, for today's wine, this is from the 2019 vintage, which actually happened to have the earliest ice wine picking date on record of November 12th. But the crew at Inniskillin, they waited to pick their ice wine grapes for a little bit longer. So this was harvested in late December, and it was harvested around -10 degrees Celsius. So it had about 37 degrees Brix at harvest. That's around 370 grams per liter starting sugar. And the juice was left to settle in tank for about 7 days before it was then inoculated with selected yeast. Fermentation for ice wine takes a long time. It typically takes upwards to 3 weeks to ferment ice wine. So this was fermenting for about 21 days. And then the wine rests in tank for about 1 month before it was then bottled. So immediately this nose just brings back a flood of memories. I used to work, my first job in the wine business was export manager for a winery in Ontario, and we exported a lot of ice wine. Cab Franc was my favorite ice wine, and I had the pleasure of traveling the world and talking a lot about Cabernet Franc ice wine. So smelling this today brings back a flood of memories. If you've never had Cab Franc ice wine, I highly recommend seeking it out. It is just such an exquisite treat. So on the nose, there's this great burnt sugar, like caramelized sugar note right off the top. Then there's beautiful strawberry preserves, a bit of candied rhubarb here. There's a touch of sour cherry as well, and even a little bit of a candied mandarin peel. Really pretty nose. There's a vanilla note. There's a touch of florality here as well. But it's just such a beautiful aroma on the nose, and you can even smell the acidity, which is kind of crazy. But you can smell the acidity, and you can almost feel your mouth start to water even before you even take a sip. Now, oh my gosh, this is so good. Okay, so in terms of the fruits, all those same fruits come through beautifully on the palate. There's an additional a sweet pastry note, which I quite like. Those strawberry preserves come through beautifully, that mandarin orange bit. There's a little bit of a spicier note on the palate as well, like a black pepper or cardamom spice note on the palate, which is great because it's just an added layer of complexity here. But what is really important about this wine is the freshness. There's so much natural acidity here. It's really quite remarkable. This wine clocks in at 265 grams per liter residual sugar, and you would never guess it because there's just so much natural acidity here to create balance. It's not cloying, it's not sticky, it's remarkably fresh. There's even a touch of tannin here. There's even a touch of tannin here on the tongue. It sits sort of in the center of the tongue, which is wonderful because that, again, provides this wonderful counterpoint to the sweetness. But this is just such a remarkable wine. It's complex. The finish goes on forever. It's also sophisticated, very refined, and there's a lot of elegance here as well. So how do we enjoy ice wine? Well, a bottle like this, because there's of course so much residual sugar here, once you've opened a bottle, actually you can put it in the fridge and you can typically get up to 3 weeks out of a bottle, if it lasts that long, but typically a bottle will last about 3 weeks in the fridge. And then in terms of serving, you would typically serve this at around 10 degrees Celsius, so not super fridge cold. You do want the fruits to express themselves, and it's a remarkable pair with stronger cheeses like blue cheese. But if you're a dessert person, there's enough residual sugar here that can actually work very well with a number of desserts, like dark chocolate-based desserts like a pot de creme would be amazing. Also, any sort of berry tart would also be perfect, like a strawberry tart or like a strawberry rhubarb pie or something like that. But the other great thing that ice wine works really well with is creamier desserts. So something like a panna cotta, for example. Like I'm thinking buttermilk panna cotta with a little bit of a raspberry coulis or a strawberry coulis, I think would be killer with this wine. These wines are really hard to find. The yields are super small. We're typically sacrificing about 30 regular bottles of Cabernet Franc table wine to make a single bottle of Cabernet Franc Icewine. So the yields are small, the wines are hard to find, and they can be a little bit expensive, but I strongly recommend if you come across one in your local wine shop, break the piggy bank and just jump off the cliff and buy a bottle, because I guarantee you if you're into dessert wines, if you love this style of wines, you will absolutely love Cab Franc Icewine. If you've had one before, let me know what you thought of it in the comments below, and of course, as always, I will be back again soon with another wine. Cheers.